thought I'd begin by reading the first few paragraphs of my little book, To Boston with Love. I ran the Boston Marathon out of love. I believe that love is the basis of all meaningful human endeavor. Running expresses my love of nature, my delight in being alive. Yet it was a love that was incomplete until it was shared with others. When I started running, I knew no other runners, male or female. I had not heard of the Boston Marathon and had never seen a track meet. I ran as a way of reaffirming some semi-conscious, ancient bond between the earth and myself as a human animal. I came to running from a feeling that something was missing in my secure suburban existence, in the life plan that the 50s and 60s had in store for me. At a deeper level, I sought to come to terms with my own mortality, with the relationship between mind, or the soul, and body, or the physical. I was groping blindly for synthesis in my life, and I found comfort in running long distance through field, forest, and city. I was looking for the bare reality of things, people and the world. That comprehension excited and awed me. I've always loved to run, ever since I was a little girl. I can remember running across green fields shimmering in the sun, and I'd feel such an upwelling sense of joy. There was just no other way of expressing it besides running full speed across the field and jumping into the air. And I grew up in Winchester and used to go up in the Fells Reservation and run with the neighborhood dogs. And I'd run for miles, and then I'd flop down under the pine trees. And I found something there in nature, a sense of beauty and peace. So my running was informed by a spiritual sense of life from a very early age. There was kind of a presence there in the sunshine and the wind, and a sense of love. Then at the School of Special Studies here at Tufts, where I studied physics, biology, mathematics, philosophy, and art at the Boston Museum School, I met a man who ran cross country. 5 miles? I was incredulous when he told me how long the track meet was. But soon I was running right along with him. The only way I got to see him was to run along with him, since he seemed to spend all his time running. We ran all over Greater Boston together. But in those days, there was no track or field for women. So I was doing something out of the ordinary already. Then I heard about the Boston Marathon. 26 miles, I couldn't believe it. 26 miles, people run 26 miles without stopping. So my dad and I went out to Wellesley in 1964, and I saw the Boston Marathon, and I just fell in love with it. And I didn't think, are there men or women? I wasn't thinking about making a social statement. I just fell in love with the race. It was totally irrational. There was no reason to run. There was no money in it. Certainly it was way far outside the norm for a woman to run a marathon. Even for men to run, there were only about 400 men running. And you got to remember, the 60s was very different than today. There was no running movement. There was no New York Marathon, no Chicago Marathon. There was no women's movement. There was no track and field for women. Women were very, very limited in their opportunities in those days. Women were expected to get married and keep house and raise the children. Very difficult for a woman to get into medical school or law school. As Mark said, they were very limited in the distances that they could run. And for a full-grown woman to run in public was thought unseemly, and God forbid that she should be seen sweating in public. So this was the world that I was growing up in at that time. So I was very, very far outside the norm, running in the woods with the dogs. So the way I trained for the Boston Marathon was very unusual. There were no books on running. I had no idea how to train. I was running in nurse's shoes. There were no women's running clothes in those days. And so I got in my Volkswagen van with my Malamute puppy named Moot, and I headed out across the United States. My parents, luckily, were on sabbatical in England, otherwise I never would have gotten away with it. So I headed off. I was in love with this country, and I was in love with the earth, and I was following this sense of presence that I had found in the woods at home. I wanted to see what it was. It was like the creative force of the universe. I was following this sense of love. And so I started driving, and every day I ran in a different spot across the country, and then at night I would sleep out under the stars. And I listened to the wind and the grass and the trees, and I was feeling more and more at home in the universe this way. I was reorienting from my suburban life to being on the earth in the universe. And the further west I got, the more amazing it seemed that here we are on this little planet, circling the sun. Circle down here in a minute. And so I know it sounds ridiculous, but this is what I did. This is the way I trained for Boston Marathon. So I got out to Nevada, and there were more stars than I had ever seen. I looked up into the sky, and I saw all these stars. In the dark places between the stars were filled with stars, and it just took my breath away, and I was in such awe, and I kept thinking, why does all this exist? This is so amazing. I mean, why are atoms and molecules and photons and all these stars? And I was just blown away by the whole thing, and I felt this tremendous sense of love, that all this was being created out of some kind of love that was so vast that it was beyond our comprehension. So I was very moved by this, and I felt that it was the same spirit that I had found in the woods back home, but it was like 1,000 times stronger here. And so I went on into California and plunged into the Pacific Ocean, having run up through the Rocky Mountains and over the Sierras, and about, I think I took about 35 days to get across. And that was the end of my journey. So then I headed home and started the Museum of Fine Arts School in the fall. I was going to run in 1965, but I sprained both ankles. So I kept training for another year, and then in the fall of 1965, I went up to Woodstock, Vermont, and ran 65 miles of the Woodstock 100-mile equestrian event. And then I knew I was ready to run Boston. I could run 40 miles the first day. I was running 40 miles at a stretch, and then 25 the second. My knees were hurting, so I thought, well, I better not risk injuring myself for Boston. But I knew then that I was able to run Boston. So then, who should arrive home for Christmas leave but Will, the man that had first introduced me to cross-country running at Tufts. And he asked me to marry him, so I said, sure. And so I went out to California. He was in the Navy. He was stationed in San Diego, and the Vietnam War was raging at that time. And President Johnson was escalating our involvement there. So he was in the Navy. So I finished my training on the beaches and in the mountains of Southern California. Then in February 1966, I wrote for my application form from the BAA, as Mark mentioned. And I was astounded to get a letter back that said women are not physiologically able to run 26 miles. You know, I've been running 40 miles at a stretch, and I was just amazed. And they said, furthermore, they're not allowed to run. They're not allowed to run more than 1.5 miles competitively. So I stewed around for a while, but instead of giving up my dream, I said all the more reason to run. And I felt sure that once they saw a woman could run these distances, that they'd open up the race for women. And even more important, I realized that this was an opportunity, because if I could prove that this prejudice and misconception about women was wrong, it would throw into question every other prejudice and misconception about women that had been used to keep women down for so many years. So, a few days before the race, I took a Greyhound bus back to Boston, and I got to Boston, I called my parents, and they thought I had gone nuts. My dad actually thought I was delusional, and somehow I thought I was under the delusion that I was going to run the Boston Marathon. He was very upset. He thought I would injure myself. So luckily he had an engagement at the Tufts Regatta that day down at Mystic Lake, and I convinced my mother to drive me to the start in Hopkinton, and she let me off there, and there I was in Hopkinton, and I was wearing my brother's Bermuda shorts and a blue hooded sweatshirt pulled up over my hair over a black tank top bathing suit and some new boys size 6 running shoes that I bought in San Diego just before boarding the bus. And so now I had to figure out how to get into the bus, how to get into the race, because I knew if they saw me, they'd throw me out, and that was my biggest fear, that I would be arrested or thrown out and I'd be prevented from demonstrating what I came to demonstrate. And so it was the catch-22 again. How can you prove you can do something if you're not allowed to do it? And how can you know you can do something if you're never allowed to try? That's the tragedy of prejudice. And I was up against it in a very real way. So I scouted around, I saw the men gathering in the pen. I found a little hollow as near to the start as I could get, and behind some bushes. And then I went out behind some buildings and ran a few miles up and down to warm up. Then, as the beginning of the race, as the moment drew near, I went back into the bushes and hid. And when the starting gun went off, I let about half the pack go by, and then I jumped into the middle of the pack. And the guys, I have to give them credit, very quickly, I could feel them studying my anatomy from the rear. Very quickly surmised that I was a woman. And I could hear them talking, and they said, "Is that a girl?" And so I smiled and looked around, and then they could see I was a girl. And then I said, "I'd like to take off this hot sweatshirt, but I'm afraid if they see I'm a woman, they'll throw me out." But the guys were really supportive, and they said, we won't let them throw you out. It's a free road. So I took off the sweatshirt, and then everyone could see I was a woman. So the press began to be interested in this, and they started phoning on ahead. They saw a story in the making, and they started phoning on ahead that there was a woman in the race, and a radio station started broadcasting my progress as I got toward Boston. So I got to Wellesley, and the women knew I was coming, and when they saw me, they let out a shriek, and they were jumping up and down and laughing and crying, and one woman, sort of a middle-aged woman with a bunch of children, standing to one side, started yelling, "Ave Maria! Ave Maria!" You know, and it was such passion in her voice that it sort of brought tears to my eyes, and I could see that my running really meant something to these women. I wanted to turn all these prejudices upside down. And so I ran on into Boston, and as Mark said, I finished 125th out of, I guess, about 420 runners. And then the press kind of came around. The governor of Massachusetts came down and shook my hand. And then I took a taxi home, and I got to my street, and there were cars parked all over the street, and I thought, gee, I wonder if someone's having a party. And then I realized they were all at my house. It was the press. And I opened the door, and there are my poor, bewildered parents standing in the middle of the room, and they said, what has this daughter of ours done now? And the phone was ringing, and people were calling to congratulate them. And my dad sort of put his arm around me and sort of said something to the effect, well, we knew she could do it. And I said, oh no, it's those gift legs, Dad. And so the next day it was front page headlines, Hub Bride, first gal to run Boston Marathon. And word went out around the world that a woman had done the impossible and run the Boston Marathon. So that was it. That was my story. And then John asked me to say something about the rest of my life, but I don't think I have time. I've probably gone way over time already. But as Mark said, I did run the next 2 years too, and the BAA recognized my 3 wins in 1996 and engraved my name on the Marathon Memorial in Copley Square with the other winners. So that's about it. Thank you.
How about one last round of applause for all of the winners? So that does it for tonight's ceremony. Thank you for coming. Okay, good luck tomorrow. Go Jumbo.